And take it away.
All right. So hello again, everyone. Once again, I'm Heather Kirksey, VP of Ecosystem and Community for the Linux Foundation Networking Projects umbrella. And this is an introduction to open source and also more generally Linux Foundation and LFN, just sort of overall mission structure and governance. So, obviously, for those of you who've been here, you know that the Linux Foundation is far more than the Linux kernel these days. I mean, many of you have helped us build, design, and launch many of the programs and projects that have ensured that being the case. How we think of ourselves at the Linux Foundation these days is that we are creating the greatest shared technology investment in history by enabling open source collaboration amongst all the folks who do that. That's sort of why we have extended sort of our scope and why we are adding new projects. We do have a fundamental belief that the technology problems facing us today are complex enough that they require large-scale collaboration, and that open source principles and open source foundations, often working hand in hand with standardization bodies that have been around, is the way to ensure that that happens. We make investments across a wide range of things, many of which you may also be aware of, from Let's Encrypt, which is a third-party certificate authority, through groups that you are probably engaged in right now, like LF Networking and CNCF. We also do a lot of work with the automotive industry. We're involved in some of the blockchain innovation out there, and we also support a fair number of web and embedded technology. And of course, that's in addition to continuing to support the kernel itself. This is often a question, which is, what is the Linux Foundation's role in projects? And they can really be thought of across 5 different areas. So one is looking at governance and membership, so ensuring appropriate legal structure, level playing field, and helping to recruit members in and managing the membership process across things like accounting and all of that somewhat boring but important stuff. Helping set up, help define, and help keep us on track around things like development processes, working to provide infrastructure that's necessary for projects, ecosystem development across marketing, events, and training. And then the last one, once again, is very much the provenance of legal, but around IP management. And this is often not one of the most fun areas, but it is one of the areas that enables our technology to truly be usable in the right ways. And y'all are here, so this is probably not new information to you, but it's actually a nice piece of information if you're ever finding yourself perhaps disagreeing with management about whether or not the investment is worth it, is that putting in the investment into open source really means that you get far more out. You'll hear sometimes about what's called the tragedy of the commons, which has often been used to describe what might happen if an open source project goes downhill, or sometimes used as maybe a reason not to get involved or why it can't work, which is that people are freeloaders. And it turns out that really people generally aren't. And when they're not freeloaders, they tend to get a lot back, and not even just in terms of warm, fuzzy things, but in terms of distinct business value to the companies that encourage and help pay for that activity. And by the way, some of this is abstract. It's going to get, briefly more concrete and then a little bit more abstract again. But if anybody ever wants to raise their hand, ask a question, etc., I've got this in full screen presenter mode, so it's not easy for me to monitor the chat, but feel free to just chime in. I do not ever mind being interrupted. Kenny can also keep an eye on any written questions that come in through the chat window. So LF Networking is made up of a number of projects, and this has grown over time. We have also archived some projects over time, as has made sense for those projects. Many of these groups are here represented with technical tracks this week, and represent a number of different areas across the sort of networking stack, from very deep data plane acceleration technology work that interfaces with hardware, all the way to something like ONAP that is looking at the entire sort of reimagining of the back office. So how we're set up, and I think most people know this, but it's sometimes easy to forget. So we are led by a governing board. Currently, our chair is Dr. Feng from China Mobile. We have a few other officers as well. The LFN Governing Board is made up of representatives from all platinum members, a voted member from our gold membership class, an elected member from our silver membership class, an elected member from the TAC, across all of the technical communities to represent the committer voice, as well as the TAC chair, the MAC chair, and of course this, us as your staff who supports the activities. The EUAG, the Compliance and Verification Committee, and the Strategic Planning Committee, as well as things like overall budget, strategy, and legal, all fall under the direct purview of the governing board. The governing board then has two types of advisory councils underneath it. The one most of you are probably engaged in is the Technical Advisory Council at the TAC, which helps facilitate cross-project collaboration, converged infrastructure, the project lifecycle plans, things like this event, that developer committer member voice to the board. And then underneath that are all of the technical projects, all of which are legally sort of, their own LLCs, as we call them, and all have their own standalone governance. The TAC is there to help all the projects work more efficiently and more collaboratively so we can be more successful. The Marketing Advisory Council sort of provides the same type of oversight for our marketing activities. We do have a few project-specific marketing groups, but for the most part, the projects have recognized that except in certain phases, for example, Anukit currently has a very active marketing group because Anukit is a new project and really does require a deeper level of engagement from its membership. But the MAC is responsible for the marketing portfolio management, defining the marketing strategy in alignment with the overall strategy of the board, defining things like top-level messaging, content, branding, marketing events, marketing of the developer events, etc. So any questions here? And I know that most of you may know this, but as I said, I think it's sometimes helpful just to remind folks. you have staff that is here to support you. So I think you probably, obviously you're hearing from me right now, but we've got Arpit, who's our GM, Mike Worcester, who's our Chief Revenue Officer and in charge of membership, Jill Lovato and Brandon Wick on the marketing and PR fronts, and then all of our technical operations staff. We also have our release engineers, who come from LFIT and a number of other different folks. And basically we are here to we are employed to be here to be sort of neutral. I used to do standards while working for a company, and I always had to be clear in my head if I was wearing the hat of my company or the hat of being a working group chair or the hat of being a board member for one of the standards bodies. The thing about the staff is that we wear only one hat, and that's sort of the neutral benefit of the collective. Which sometimes means that our answers may be no. Our answers may be that is a great request or a great desire, but let's look at how to accomplish it differently. But the point is that we're not ever telling anyone no because we don't care. It's because we are wearing these hats that need to make sure that everyone is listened to, and that as we walk through, it really is to the benefits of everyone to the best of our ability to interpret that. So, just want to make sure that people kind of, sort of know where we're coming from sometimes as staff. But at the end of the day, we're here to ensure that LF networking is successful and all the projects under it are successful. So there are a lot of ways to get involved. Sometimes really people think that it can only be contributing code or contributing to specification efforts, specifically in the case of a NUCET. But really there are a lot of ways. It can be participating in TSC calls, which once again are open to everyone, whether or not you're an elected TSC member for any project. Attending events like these, contributing to documentation, working with the EUAG, filing bug reports, triaging bug reports, closing down, sort of fixing and closing bug reports, getting involved in meetup groups, talking, helping drive test cases, and that can be for client compliance and verification or for the test cases for any specific project. And then, reviewing and submitting code patches is obviously important, but it is not the only deeply important strategic or tactical way to participate in a project and to ensure its success. And then also with marketing, being as a marketing group very closely entwined with our technical communities, perhaps more than sometimes might happen in your companies. You'll hear from marketing perhaps a lot more and maybe be invited to participate in things like news sharing and promotions, maybe writing blogs for us, doing webinars, doing social. One of the things is that our marketing team is relatively small compared to the overall size of our community. And what that means is that many times the community will have great ideas that we haven't thought of. So if there is a blog or a webinar that you think would be a really great idea to do, we can help you shape it up, and maybe help you sort of make it accessible and compelling to a broader audience. But we really do love to hear the stories, the insights, and the innovation that we're doing. Obviously, we've had various opportunities for demos and proofs of concept. Probably many of you have been hearing about the the 5G super blueprint. That's something that you can get involved in, and that would be great. And then obviously participating in events in various ways. But let's say that you are ready to contribute code. And by the way, I'm using code here a bit more broadly, specifically coming as I do from the NUCET context. Code can specifically be code. It could also be, contribution to technical specifications and architecture definitions and things that really drive and define the code itself. I will be calling out things like release documentation, project documentation, and testing out separately, but those are also forms of contribution that are very important. But anyway, to go back, let's just say, sort of in the sense that most people think about it, you're ready to contribute code. You're excited about being an open source. You're excited about the LF networking project that you are committed to. You're standing on this glorious precipice and you're like, I'm going to do a patch. You're not ready, actually, probably to submit your first patch. And that's not to say that there's anything wrong with you or anything that about your knowledge. It's more about the fact that you might want to just get to know things just a little bit better. So first of all, get to know the neighbors. If you are newly arrived in the neighborhood, you've probably all had neighbors that have arrived and come in and knocked on your door and said, hi, we're your new neighbors. We noticed that your fence isn't very well maintained. Also, we think that it would be better if we changed the speed limit in the neighborhood. Maybe we could add a roundabout. We don't like the fact that your kids are playing outside in the yard, right? That's not a really good way to make your neighbors like you. Showing up, assuming that you know more than the neighborhood does, and assuming that you can dictate from right off the bat is not a great way to have your suggestions incorporated, and it's not very kind or thoughtful. Because you do not know the situations of your neighbors or what has happened over time that has made your neighborhood what it is. On the other hand, it's always good for the existing neighborhood to be open to suggestions because over time, right, there is that sort of tendency towards groupthink, where because it's always been this way, it always should be this way. That's not great either, but my suggestion is when you come in, get to know people, right? Attend and listen into a couple TSC meetings just to see who's participating and where they're coming from. Offer to help, be kind. Don't sort of immediately zoom in and say, I must know more than you do because I can see things that ought to be fixed. This is a place that presumably you want to live for a while. So you want to build relationships rather than claim authority or dictate action. So along the lines of that, get to know your community as people. At our opening plenary this morning, I was talking about the fact that, I'm not as available this week because I'm currently injured. There are probably people in our community who don't feel as comfortable or as empowered to speak up and let you know that, but it's probably true for them. Start by making positive assumptions and giving benefit of the doubt and getting to know who these people are, right? They're not code generating, documentation, architecture generating robots who are there to serve you or any other greater purpose. They are humans who have committed to this purpose and are choosing to spend their time on this purpose, and they deserve to be treated as so. There's all sorts of information that you can get from mailing lists, Slack channels, meetings, looking at wiki pages, perusing repos. There is a fair amount of information out there. Sometimes it can be overwhelming. There are people to help for that, TSC chairs, your LF staff, etc. I said, don't come in assuming you know more, but don't be afraid to speak up, and please do ask questions. Whether in email format, on a Slack channel, etc. People really like to answer questions. Listen, listen. If you ask questions, listen to the answer and maybe ask a few people the same question so you can compare answers. And finally, especially if you're new, offer to help with non-technical tasks. You will be a hero if you do so, and you'll help improve the work. And you'll you'll just get a lot of respect and love by doing that. In terms of don't, many of these are the converse of what I just said, but don't forget to read the FA manual. If there is insufficient documentation, that's a great thing to bring up, but make sure you have read the documentation. Also, it's a great place to put in your first patch. If you are coming in new, and especially if you're maybe an end user who is not, you're more on the code consumption side of the equation than you are on the code contribution side of the equation. Attempting to read the manual and attempting to maybe deploy the software, and then putting in specific patches about what's wrong, that will be so helpful. And especially if they are specific, so we can actually, apportion them to technical members via Jira, or whatever, task management system a project uses. That's also very helpful. And, volunteer to help yourself. That's always great. And as I said, don't be rude, but also don't be intimidated. Open source projects are only as successful as the resources and people who participate and drive them forward. So if you're coming in to invest your, precious time and energy, you do have a voice to be heard and a voice to be listened to and a voice to be respected. And then finally, one really important thing is don't be seen as pushing a corporate agenda. You might actually have some specific things that you do need to accomplish on behalf of the entity that's funding your presence here. No one thinks that that's wrong. Everyone is in the same boat. It's only when things can only be about your specific company and about the needs of your specific company, your specific sub-project, or your own specific personal private technical goals that you at some point are not helping as much as you think you are. In fact, maybe hurting, and are not moving the project forward. Once again, the project is something that belongs to everyone that participates in it. That's hundreds of people, that's multiple entities. Kenny, what were you saying about the number of companies and continents represented this morning? And that was at 5 a.m. Pacific time, just for our opening keynotes.
Yeah, we had at a rough count, 24 countries, and we had every continent except Antarctica represented on the call. So
yeah, so
number
that
of
tells
companies,
you something about the number of individuals, companies, members who are represented. We're here to find something that works for the biggest number of all of them. So being seen to push a very specific, individualized, and especially corporate agenda is it's not going to help sort of your reputation, and it's definitely not going to help get the goals that your corporation might have actually incorporated, and it's not going to help the overall organization be successful. So just keep that in mind. Keep in mind the listen, and help ensure that everyone is, that you are part of the rising tide that lifts all boats, basically. And you will have a much better path in getting some of the specific things you might need accomplished. So next principle of open source is upstream first. So what this really means is that you will have much better success if anything that you are developing internally with respect to a project is brought as early to the project as possible. sometimes this can be counterintuitive. I know a lot of engineers might feel uncomfortable bringing, a feature or something until they figured it out and they feel that it is somewhat complete, right? There's a certain type of perfectionism or not willing to be seen, not having thought through everything, sometimes on the part of engineers. But that's a tendency to fight in open source. Because if you bring something that's already been to a certain extent designed and thought through, and no one's had the ability to give input, it's not going to be something that's attractive to everyone else. You also might not have thought about the impact on things like testing projects, on the integration projects, on the APIs of other projects. You also might not have been able to hear other good ideas. And then the longer that you carry somewhat forked code internally, the higher cost that you are actually bearing to maintain that code, potentially on a much older version of the project itself. Open source projects are not corporate entities with consulting and support organizations. We're not CA, we're not paid support contracts for old versions of the kernel. We're a group of developers who do the best we can to keep up with patches, but for the most part, are generally looking ahead, with an eye to stability of especially things like APIs and platform components. But things do evolve over time and things do change over the time. And the longer that you're keeping something that's really key, you're going to have to internally maintain the work of that integration as the project goes over time. So basically, we say upstream first because one, the earlier you bring your ideas and your code and your feature ideas, the more easily they are going to be integrated and accepted by other folks, as well as the sooner you can also shift some of that maintenance burden to being in line with what's being done by the projects already, because they're not just going to do that for you in the way that perhaps you can ask a vendor to you to do that. Let me know if that makes sense. Anyway, you will hear quite a bit about the importance of swimming upstream in open source. However, one must beware of bears when swimming upstream. There are ways to do it wrong. There are ways to not think it through. And there are therefore ways of encountering rather grumpy, loud creatures who might have big, jaws. And some of the things to think about with that, I sort of mentioned already, but the sooner you involve the community in feature design, the more that you will get good feedback and the more likely the community will be to accept it. There are some great anecdotes from older days of the Linux kernel in terms of very important features being excluded from the Linux kernel for years, and it turning into highly political debates, mostly because companies came and brought hugely already written code bases that were a sizable percentage of the existing kernel code and just wanted to dump it without discussion because they'd already done the work of figuring it out. Whereas the community, the existing Linux committers, contributors, and maintainers really wanted to be part of that. That's especially true if you're looking at things like cross-project and cross-foundation integrations. It's going to work a lot better if we go to a project in, say, CNCF with use cases, user stories, and requirements, than going in and saying, these 5 aspects of the way you've thought about CNI are wrong. When CNI has been already thought about by a large number of people and designed for their needs, it might not have been designed for our needs, which we can all get to a recognition about, but it just works a lot better with requirements and an invitation to feature design. Always explain your motivations and use cases. That gets things far. Also, submit code in small patches. As I was talking before, I think sometimes as engineers, we have a tendency of wanting to submit a finished product. Like we feel as though that's what we owe. And so we'll give like we sometimes think it's good to give large chunks of code, but that makes it very hard for anyone who's trying to incorporate that code to interact with it, to comment on it, to review it, or to see how it impacts, integrates, or improves what's already there. Also, expect time to spend teaching your code. There's nothing that will make other open source developers angry at you than what's sometimes called drive-by code, which you'll see referenced in the don't column. If you have code that you're going to bring in, you need to be prepared to talk about it and explain it. That way other people know how to use it. They know how to test it. They know how to integrate it. They know how to file bug reports on it. They know how to help you by reviewing bug reports against it. It's an upfront investment that pays huge dividends. Also, remember to review others' code. The time that someone spends to review your code is a gift they are giving to you, and vice versa. Code in open source is expected to be reviewed by multiple entities, preferably not from the same company. I think some of our projects have been a little bit more lax in making this an official policy, but I know that in some open source projects, a patch cannot come in unless it has been +1 by 3 separate reviewers, all of whom must work for different companies. So that means that if you want your patch to be accepted, which means you want other people to spend time reviewing your code, you need to sort of also spend time reviewing their code. And that's how all the code advances with the right level of quality and multi-party review. And then related to code review and your responses to people's review of your code, always be respectful. If someone has reviewed your code, that is a gift of their time and energy. And if you respond to their gift with rudeness, then, well, Miss Manners has opinions on what that means, but really what you are saying is that you do not value their time, you do not respect their time, and you are uninterested in other opinions. And that really is not the way of open source success. And it's both rude and unkind, and will basically not get you a lot of help in the future when you might want to ask for help. So I've touched most of the don'ts, but let me see, drive-by code, drop huge patches. Also, try not to replicate something that already exists. I do find this sometimes. Once again, sometimes as engineers, we have this, innate optimizing tendency where, we see code that's not great and we're like, oh, I could write it better. When really what might be best is if you improve on it. A lot of time can be wasted by false starts and by replicating the same capabilities in multiple projects. It's not a good use of anyone's time or energy. I think I talked about making your code the community's problem, but also, once again, don't treat the release manager like your personal resource. And I'll extend that to do not treat the LFN or PM staff as your personal admin support. We're really here to help facilitate the project, and the release manager is, whether from LFN staff or an elected or appointed community member, they're here to define the release process and ensure that the release process happens and enforce the release process. They're not here to do your part of the release process for you. That also goes true for anyone on an integration team, anyone on a documentation team, anyone on a testing team. and anyone in IT. So try not to, once again, try not to take feedback personally. If someone has an idea about how to improve their code, that means they care about your code. That means they've taken time to review it and they want it to work and be successful. Really take that as the gift and the compliment that it is. I know sometimes if you've worked hard on something and someone has input on it, it can feel as though they're calling your offspring unattractive. But really what they're saying is, I want to help build this house better with you. And once again, I said, don't focus only on your feature code. So I said I would call out a few things specifically, but don't just read the manual, help write the manual. One of the perennial complaints about open source projects, let's be honest, it's one of the perennial complaints about all software out there, is that documentation could be improved, both in amount, quality, and timeliness. In open source, this is sometimes particularly exacerbated because we tend to get code writers, code contributors contributed by our member companies, but very less often documentation writers. So we often depend on our coders to do documentation, which I think is probably one of the least favorite activities of many of the developers out there. But this is a great place, especially for end users to participate. If your company is getting freshly involved and not sure about where to put maybe code writers, putting some developers or technical writers in to help with documentation is amazing. And it's just something that all of us, to a certain extent, just need to do here more than we might be supported in this back home in a corporate environment. But this is important. I mean, I think there was a recent study that basically said one of the big, I think the largest, if not the second, either the largest or second largest barrier to adoption of multiple open source projects was insufficiency of documentation. So to the extent that we can address and improve that, the better we can improve and address the adoption of the code that we write. Get involved in test and integration. Once again, there is not a separate QA team sitting around. I mean, that's probably less the case these days with things like agile methodologies and DevOps. But, if you want people to use your sub-project or your features, you need to help contribute, tests that exercise your features to the test projects. Also get involved in the integration projects. Most of the projects here have them. They work closely with our release engineering and CI/CD engineers from LFIT to get our builds working. It's a great way to get a lot of knowledge of the entirety of the project. It's a great way to understand how it all goes together and actually become sort of a superstar guru of understanding, what's going on and how the code works and how it deploys. So another place, if you are new getting involved, these are just great places to have immediate impact, immediate involvement, as well as increasing your technical understanding more quickly than just about anything else you can do. Finally, open source communities really, like most human communities, including even our company teams, are really run on trust. There is not really a single person here who, outside of sort of, coaching or code of conduct violations, can truly, at the end of the day, tell you what to do. On the other hand, no one necessarily needs to do what you want them to either. We build our success through trusting each other and helping each other. And the difference between someone immediately dropping everything to help you and the difference between them being perhaps less forthcoming in their aid really is based on what they've seen of your behavior as you've been in the open source project, how helpful you've been, how kind and respectful you've been, how much you've contributed to documentation and reviewing others' code, how open you have been to others' code feedback. Those are the things that are really going to determine the extent to which you have influence. Open source is really run far more by influence than by authority. And that's very different than the way most of our corporate hierarchies work. But so it takes some while to get used to, but it is it's a good thing to understand, right? It's what you give in is what you will receive. It's kind of a very immediately karmic kind of environment. But there's also the way in which, like a safety deposit box or keeping a large account balance. If you've been, banking for a while and you've generally had, let's say a good account balance of being trustworthy, at those times where you're having a particularly bad day, you're really trying to rush something through and don't have the time to answer questions in the way that you normally would, you get a lot more grace and forgiveness for those moments if you have been giving in of yourself. And then, talking about being new, as you grow and as you understand, and as people have been kind to point out things to you, to walk you through code, to point you to documentation, to answer your questions, pay it forward. It's one of the most extraordinarily beautiful things about open source is that so often it's not the tragedy of the commons, it is the beauty of the connected. People do really take care of people here. People are kind and answer questions here, and people care about everyone's success here more often than not. It is a rare and beautiful situation, and let's all commit to helping ensure that it remains so. And then, sort of one last thing to think about is, we are scattered across the globe. We have been in this global pandemic for some time. It's even worse in some of our geographies right now. So our ability to meet globally face to face still faces some challenges for some time, but local meetup group, open source networking user groups are a great way to connect with your local community. And as specific local situations change, even if the global situation is not what we might want it to be, if it's possible where you are, you can start getting together again with folks who are interested in this. We are relaunching this program. It definitely went into hibernation during as the pandemic hit and has been wearing on. But as some areas are beginning to experience vaccinations, we are wanting to encourage these local groups to get together again. And we're migrating to a new platform that has a lot more capabilities. And so that will be great. And so we just really encourage you to either get involved if there's already one there and you can see that URL, or if there's not one in your area, that's an opportunity for you to step up and have the fun of building something from scratch in your area to help your local developers get together, get to know each other. And we generally will kick in budget for, beer and pizza for these meetings, coming from the LF networking budget, or gluten-free alternatives to gluten and to beer and pizza as you might require. Yep. So just finally, open source. I think the best way to sum up the let's see, 45 plus minutes I've been talking, is that open source is a team sport, right? Teams that are overly reliant on an individual player or have star players, but that destroy the team spirit, or ability to build a team, often the most successful teams are teams that build a team, or build from a team perspective, and that's what we're doing here. One of my favorite movies in the world, and anyone who's heard me talk about this before knows this, but it is a movie called Miracle. And it is about the US men's hockey team's quote unquote miracle on ice at the 1980 Winter Lake Placid Olympics. Why I love this movie is that there was not a single superstar on this team. And the coach basically said, I need the right players who can gel. And all throughout the movie, he's asking them who they play for. And they all start, it was not a professional, it was not a hockey team made up by professionals, but of college players. And he asked them over and over again, who do you play for? And they kept saying their college team, until one moment as they're entering the Olympics, and one person said, I play for this Olympic team. And so when you're here, we are employed by companies. That's where we're coming from. We have obligations to them. When this particular season is over, or when a particular match is over, we go home to them. But when we're here, we play for LF networking, for the projects of LF networking to which we contribute. We play for something larger than our individual selves. The name on the front of the jersey is a hell of a lot more important than the name on the back of the jersey, which, if you're not into sports, might not be a reference that you get, but it means that the team name is more important than your individual name. Not that you shouldn't be acknowledged, not that any individual should not be celebrated. We have numbers of ways of doing that, but at the end of the day, all of us serve. We serve our ecosystem, we serve our global community, we serve the global networking infrastructure. We serve LF networking and its projects. And when we are here in this time and place, that's who we serve, and it's good to remember it. I actually wake up many days, first of all, excited about how many of the colleagues I work with bring such a beautiful team collaborative spirit, but also reminding myself that at the end of the day, I work for the global communications industry, and to them, my loyalty and my energy and, my belief system to a certain extent lies. I also am a little bit into comms networking. So you can laugh at me for being a little weird on that. But anyway, we are a team sport. So anyway, I have spent so much time talking, but no one interrupted me. And this was meant to be sort of an intro where maybe folks who were new and didn't feel comfortable asking questions, had the ability to take in information. But really, if you're not tired of my voice, I am tired of my voice. So I'm going to pause, open the floor for questions, for discussion, or maybe just for chatter before we wait for our first daily summary on the opening day of our LFN Developer and Testing Forum.
Yeah, thanks, Heather. This is Ronnie. First of all, I think it's a great presentation and information. Most of the information here is relevant not only for the LF or LFN, but for any open source project. I wanted to touch upon something you said a few minutes ago about in the do's and don'ts about not pushing your company's agenda.
Yep.
I say it a bit differently. I think kind of the opposite. We're all pushing our company's agenda. We just need not to be bullies about it. and respect the agendas of other companies
Yeah.
and not make it our thing, but make it part of the way we interact and play in the community. I mean, there's no point in hiding that we all have
Yes.
company agendas. So
Yeah.
just, I mean, what I practice
Totally
is,
agreed, Ronnie. Yeah, totally agreed. And I think that's why I said it's not that anyone doesn't realize that. You know what, that bullet would probably benefit from being said to push, not be seen as only as pushing only your company's agenda or only your own agenda, like to make it more specific. It's maybe behaving with enlightened self-interest, perhaps.
yeah, the way I kind of
Yeah.
try to advise my colleagues and others is to try to look at it more broadly, and maybe our company's agenda is part of maybe a broader agenda, and it's better to push the broader agenda and not our narrow company's
Yeah.
agenda. But but just be nice about it. That's
Yes.
my point.
Yes. Well, it's also, as I was saying, like review others' code because they need to review yours. It's like sometimes companies get really caught up in maybe pushing a feature that they need, and then they forget that the feature won't work if certain fundamental aspects of the platform that are less sexy perhaps aren't getting the right amount of attention. And so sometimes it's like, if you want your agendas to succeed, you're going to have to maybe work on stuff that's either what other companies want or the stuff that enables, that's not fun, but enables what all of you want to actually work too.
Like security.
Yeah, it's like security, like testing, like integration, like documentation, like scalability, like
The list goes on and on.
like reliability. Yeah. But no, thank you, Ronnie. That's a very good point, and thank you for putting it a different way and refining how I put it.
And I guess socialability would be a new term which comes through with what you mentioned at the very end. So Sagar, this side from EST, the teamwork, I really like that part. I've just joined this community and I'm trying to understand how things work. Thank you, Heather.
No, you're welcome. Yeah, and one thing I will say too is you're like trying to figure out how things work. Just because we don't have the same sort of there are requirements, there are some leadership positions, but there's not a lot of positional authority, and there's not maybe the same sort of hierarchy that exists within a company. So one thing to keep in mind is that it can look and feel a little chaotic if you're new, but think of it as being, organic. And that also, even if it might look a little organic, it does mean that people are very willing to help. So.
Sure, Heather. Thank you.
Okay, we'll give it a couple more seconds. And people are crafting any additional questions you may have. Heather, I just wanted to note that I think given the format that we had today, with the primary focus being on EUAG topics, we don't have anything in the daily summary.
Okay.
So maybe we forego that and pick up our daily summaries tomorrow.
Yeah, I think it still might be useful because so many of those EUAG topics to me felt very cross community, and maybe things that developers from all the projects might want to see. So it might be the case that we don't need to do the daily summary in-person activity, but I actually would like to encourage maybe just high-hitting bullet points and then the link to the minutes, because I do feel as though the topics that were brought up today were of pretty wide interest, even for those who might not have shown up. Does that make sense? Not trying to give you busy work, but just saying it still might be nice to just sort of capture, top level important things in the summaries. But I'm fine with ending the in-person meeting portion for today a little early.
Yeah, just make sure that the wiki page is filled out accordingly.
Yeah.
So any additional questions, thoughts, comments?
Any sort of, Kenny, could we actually update the calendar and just put it on the wiki that we do want to include this, but because it was all plenary sessions, we're not going to do the in-person summary today, just get that on the wiki, or Jim or EUAG chairs or someone.
Yep, we can get that out there.
Thank you. Oh, this is another fact of open source is the, what do I call it? Active volunteering, which is someone needs, I need something to happen. No one puts their hands up. All right, that means I need to do it, or I need to encourage or influence someone to do it for me. There can sometimes in open source be there's so many of us, something will occur, which means if everyone's responsible, no one's responsible. So, it is good to remember that, raising your hand sometimes when you see something that would be beneficial is one of the most helpful things to do, or to say, I can't do it, but I need someone with this skill set. Or once you've been around long enough, maybe know who's a person to identify who you'd like to help you, if they're willing to give you that time or energy. So, and that gets back to sometimes the trust building, that coming in and saying, I need someone to help me with someone or with something, or I can't do this on my own. If people have seen you help in the past, they're far more likely to help you in the present. So that sort of enlightened self-interest concept does go a long way. All right, y'all. Well, I really appreciate so many of you sticking around to hear this. Like, I really hope that this wasn't just too much of me talking at you. But I just, it's so great to see all of you again at one of these virtual events. I can't wait till, when it's possible, I see, a growing number of you face to face. And let's go be productive, but most importantly, continue to be excellent to each other over the rest of the course of this week.